Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of chapter 6 on insight, wisdom and the right view in the context of the lecture series True Dhamma, following in the footsteps of the Buddha. My name is Dr. Florian Lau from the Dhamma Hub, and today we will continue where we left off last time. As this lecture series is, or this chapter overall, might be a bit longer than the other chapters, as it is very, very important, it might take a bit longer than an hour. But I hope you will bear with me, as the knowledge that I present here is absolutely essential if you want to get over your suffering once and for all. Last time we discussed what knowledge even is. This time around we will start with the process of insight and the heartwood of the Dhamma in depth. And the lecture last time was structured as follows. We discussed the knowledges and what it is. Then we had a short story time. Then we discussed the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path in detail. And we stopped at this very slide concerning insights on the path. And before we continue to the rest of the presentation today, I want to start my timer, as I always forget that. And then we want to do 5 minutes of non-reactivity or mindfulness meditation. As you will probably know by now how this works, I will just pause for a moment and will assume that you just continue with the lecture afterwards. So here's a short pause. And now I assume that you are done and we continue with the lecture. So the first insight on the path that I want to discuss is not necessarily canonical. It is the insight of mind and body. It does not really date back to the suttas, but only in the sense that the Buddha never named this kind of insight in the suttas. And this insight requires very weak tanha. And it is a bit like stepping back from a very big canvas to see more things at once. So you are less absorbed in your experience and can see other things that you previously did not notice. And the meditator with weak enough tanha and the right instructions, as an example, will notice that mind and the body are not identical things. There are parts of your experience that are bodily, and there are parts of your experience that are mental. So there is the mind and there are the 5 physical senses, more or less. And yeah, the 5 physical senses, as you will notice, meet in the mind. The mind kind of organizes the 5 physical senses, and all the information from the 5 physical senses and also from the mind will meet in the mind. And overall, due to the weakened tanha and due to that insight, the sense of ownership is weakened a little bit, as we cannot identify with the body or with the mind as much as before. Before that, we have just taken them up and occupied them in a sense. And afterwards we notice, okay, what we previously thought to be true turned out not to be true. And then we become a bit skeptical when it comes to our own worldviews. And this is a pretty big correction concerning the prior and wrong worldview. And a chunk of our suffering usually fades with such an insight. As the less we are absorbed and the less attached we are to the body, as an example, the less we will suffer. The second insight that people usually encounter is an insight into cause and effect. And again, this does not necessarily date back to the suttas either, but also it does not date back by that name. It is obviously something that people will discover at some point or another. Namely, they will discover that the mind is generally the master of our experience or of the body, and the body is a servant. Actions in general, no matter if by body, speech and mind, are determined by a simultaneously present intention in the mind. Without that intention, an action cannot follow. So that action of ours, no matter if bodily, if verbal, or if mental, if it's just thinking is also an action, it can only happen based on that intention. And this is true for mental actions too, and I really want to emphasize that, because most people do not consider mental activity as an action of theirs. But it is. It is very much an action, and again, it can only be there when the cause of that mental action are there, as the causes. And in this case, one of the causes, the necessary conditions, would be an intention that is simultaneously present. And the same is, by the way, true for speech. Thinking and pondering one breaks into speech is a citation from the suttas that the Buddha repeated over and over. So the speaking is also accompanied by thinking, as an example, and very much accompanied by intention. And those elements usually happen on their own according to cause and effect. Namely, when there is an intention in the mind, then those things just happen. And so this insight removes even more ownership and the feeling of, let's say, doing or activity that we ultimately want to overcome when it comes to Buddhism. But we have to overcome it gradually, and we have to overcome it through our sense of control. It cannot happen by denying our control. We are affected by our wrong assumptions, and we must work with them. And the next and absolutely most important insight is an insight into the three marks, or as they are also called, the universal perceptions. Because no matter what you experience, those three marks are always part of it. And those are anicca, or impermanence or unownability, dukkha, or suffering or unease, and anatta, or non-self, non-control, or however you want to call it. And the important part is that the Buddha usually called them developed perceptions. So they are not there from the beginning, while technically they are there as a potential, but you cannot access them because you do not fulfill the necessary precondition to see them properly. And seeing anicca as an example uproots our assumption of ownership or control if we do it rightly. And it usually feels a bit unpleasant when we do it, because everything that is anicca, which undermines our sense of control, is always also dukkha, because things that are not under our control make us suffer to a degree. And thus seeing dukkha usually leads to a devaluing of our desires and a devaluing of that which we thought that we had control over. So we immediately let go of that which we have been attached to before, simply because we do not like to own things that make us suffer. And the three marks, and this is very important, are more significant than logic. And things that are more significant than logic are necessary to undo views that are implicit to us. And this is a thing or a theme, an overarching theme that we will encounter over and over again. We can only uproot our wrong and hidden or implicit views by something that is more significant than those things. And the three are more or less three aspects of the very same thing, as they always more or less occur together. Anatta follows from the others, but you can regard them pretty much as the same thing. And from the Samyutta Nikaya, the 35th collection, number 1, we can see that the Buddha often said, and this is pretty much everywhere in the suttas, what is impermanent is suffering, what is suffering is non-self. And you should, and this is very important, apply those perceptions to unwholesome qualities and not to helpful qualities. So in essence, if you apply the perception of anicca or dukkha to something helpful, like a sense of shame when it comes to overindulgence in sensuality or drugs, then that is not a good thing. That is not something you should do. In fact, you can create a huge hindrance out of it for yourself when you try to overcome sensuality, but do not feel bad on account of it anymore. So that should be avoided by all means. And we want to start in order with analyzing those perceptions in detail. And I like to start with the anicca, as it is the most significant, immediately visible part of our experience. And I often like to call it sankhara anicca, to really make sure that it is a universal characteristic of all sankharas, of all determined things. And anicca overall is a greatly misunderstood characteristic of experience. It does precede logic and reasoning, so it is kinda about what must be there for logic and reasoning to even work. This is a good intuition. And anicca is basically change or impermanence on a very personal level. It is unownability, and it must be contemplated on this subjective level. It must always be applied subjectively. It must be applied to things where you have attachments or assumptions, because it will not matter with any other thing. It is not objective flux or objective change or regarding the world as a particle system or anything like that. You must always apply the perception of impermanence to things that you deem personal and thus permanent, to uproot that assumption of permanence and to uproot that assumption of control through seeing that things just change on their own. This is a very important aspect when it comes to anicca. In essence, it is the knowledge of, oh, those things are already there, changing on their own, and I'm not doing them. And seeing anicca correctly implies the understanding of dependent origination. So the first time you really see anicca on the level where it matters, for example, by applying it to your intentions, you will experience pretty much stream entry or attain the right view. But nonetheless, you must contemplate this over and over again to really understand it and at some point have the right perception of anicca. So you try to get it right, and at some point you will get it right, but for that to happen, you must try over and over again. And concerning the negative feeling of anicca, I have prepared a small exercise where you interpret or experience anicca as something not so nice. And I like to present it as an experiment. Again, do the top part first, then pause, and then read the solution. And I like to convey the point as follows. Imagine being a prisoner about to be executed in the very near future. Before the dreaded day, you can voice one last wish and enjoy whatever pleasure you want. You could ask for whatever you wish, except for delaying the inevitable. And now the question. Would you be able to enjoy your last meal, movie, sexual intercourse, or whatever? Think about it a bit, ponder it a bit, and then come back to the conclusion. But yes, the answer is very likely no, as only one thing could be on your mind, namely your immediate execution, your loss of future pleasure. The only reason we mindlessly enjoy sense pleasures is the fact that we ignore our own impermanence, the impermanence of those pleasures and all those things. Once we stop ignoring that, anicca will be very, very present, and anicca will be uncomfortable, because all the enjoyment that we have in the world depends on a false assumption of impermanence, of permanence. We make things permanent in our mind so that we can enjoy them. So whenever we contemplate anicca, it always has to be a bit uncomfortable, or we don't do it right. This is very, very important. It is very possible to contemplate anicca in a wrong way, and you will immediately notice that, at least before stream entry, by not feeling a bit bad about it. So whenever you relinquish control or undermine your sense of control, it will feel bad. It can even feel bad to the point of outright terror, especially when you have not cultivated virtue before. When you cultivated virtue, it will just accepting the unavoidable. But when there is no virtue present, then it can feel supremely bad. And the next characteristic is dukkha, or sankhara dukkha, and this one is especially important to understand because there is, as the usual translations go, dukkha with a big D, with a capital D, and dukkha with a small d. Dukkha is more or less the experience of suffering. It is a symptom of ignorance, not the battlefield kind alone, as we have already discussed, and it is essentially non-contentment, non-peacefulness. And dukkha is aversion to the arisen experience as a whole and wanting things to be different. And what we ultimately try to overcome in Buddhism by liberating our citta, our heart mind, so to speak, through wisdom. And dukkha, with a capital D, is the suffering component of all sankharas. This is why it is called sankhara dukkha. It is a universal perception. Everything that is impermanent has a characteristic of dukkha, of insecurity, of unease, because those things will change. It is universal, and it is there in all intentional activities, pretty much. And sukha is the opposite of dukkha, as we have already discussed. Sukha describes the state that we want to achieve by no longer being subjected to dukkha. And again, I like to convey the point of dukkha, this time the small d dukkha, to distinguish it from the capital D dukkha with this small experiment. Top part first, bottom part next. Try to really understand how craving is suffering. You have to deny your senses their wishes for a time. Sit down in meditation and vow to yourself to do absolutely nothing for a long time even. How does this feel? Is it nice, or can it be excruciating, depending on the duration and what else is going on in the background? Ponder it for a bit. If you are a seasoned meditator, you might have to imagine another scenario that is unpleasant that you have to endure. But yeah, the initial sense restraint is usually accompanied by the arising of bad emotions, bad feelings, and a lot of pressure to fix them. The longer you restrain your senses, the stronger they will rebel against you, and the stronger the urge to fix the problem will get. This should lead to a very vivid experience of craving and shows you that the only reason we regard our desires as good is that we immediately act out of them. Our desires oppress us. The pleasure of sensuality is just the removal of the pain of craving. So by removing craving, we remove suffering too, again, which is very important. And the last and most important characteristic, one could argue, is the perception or the mark of non-self. And self overall, which might be important to understand, requires the 5 aggregates which make up our entire experience, to formulate. Those are separate heaps, separate parts of our experience. And the self is usually the owner, the controller, which is external to experience as a whole. So the self separates experience into mine and other, more or less. And we control the mine, and the other is not so much controlled. And it has attachment as a characteristic, so that things emotionally matter to us. For example, when we cut our finger, it matters to us a lot. But when another person cuts their finger, it does not matter too much, simply because of the level of attachment. We are not attached to the finger of another person, but we are very much attached to our fingers or the fingers of our loved ones or our children or whatever. So that is a difference. When we remove the attachment, then the significance of cutting ourselves is not so present anymore, and we don't suffer in the same way as before. And for when a person perceives impermanence, the perception of non-self becomes established in him. This is something that the Buddha often said. So whenever we want to perceive anatta, namely non-self, we must perceive it through the perception of impermanence, which leads to the perception of dukkha, which then leads to the perception of non-self. And anatta, in contrast to self or atta, means ownerlessness, masterlessness, and not external to experience. So that is what the Buddha mainly taught. Basically, half the suttas have something to say about non-self, as that is what we pretty much do in meditation. We try to cultivate that perception. If that perception is not there in your meditation, if you consider yourself an advanced meditator, then you are doing things wrong. Or you should reflect if you are doing things wrong. It does not have to be there in full-fledged strength all the time, but the tendency should be towards more perception of anatta and not towards less perception of anatta. And it should not be just on the meditation cushion, it should be all the time. And what the Buddha suggested is pretty much contemplating as follows: this is not mine, this I am not, this is not for me. Those aspects are very different, by the way. It's not just a list of synonyms. For me is something different than this is not mine and this is I am not. So that's important to keep in mind. And there is sense of self, which is also very important, but it is not yours. You cannot control it. It does not have the characteristics of a self. Thus, self turns into non-self based on the insights that we are going to discuss next. And this is also very important. This is just a teaser. We will discuss it in detail. Because all sankharas are impermanent and suffering, all things as a result are non-self. So and you must really try to see anatta rightly for sufficiently long without confirmation that you are doing it right to gain the right view. And it varies from person to person how long it takes, but you have to repeat that perception over and over again, both before and after, and at some point you will be completely free from the sense of self. And as suffering completely relies on this sense of self, you will also be completely free from suffering. And just to give you an intuition, to make it easier to accept the fact of non-self, I like to give you this kind of pie chart. As an example, there is a very small slice of conscious experience, and there's a very big slice, let's call it slice, or basically the entire pie of subconscious experience. And even the conscious part will gradually move towards the non-self aspect. And the conscious part that we are very aware of and are attending to currently is usually associated with the self, namely with control, with ownership, and all those other things. And the subconscious part is just ignored. It happens all the time too, but as we are not attending to it, we do not own it so much. So our body is, for example, always moving in certain ways, but we do not notice it, and thus we do not make it ourselves. The self is always closely related to our area of attention. And you can also give it, you might also have an easier time accepting the entire thing based on certain parts of science. And the first observation is that things must be there before we become conscious of them. And certain brain scans, as an example, reveal that. They can give you an intuition. They are not the entire truth of non-self. I'm just trying to make it easier for you to get into the topic. Science cannot really deal with the insights in Buddhism, which is also very important. Because again, the scientific worldview contradicts with the experience as it presents itself. That is very important to keep in mind. And those brain scans, as an example, just to give you an intuition, can show that we are about to do something before we do something. And we have seen that in Plato's cave analogy in chapter 0, which is also important. So if you want more on that, maybe you go back to that chapter. And in essence, the senses are like cameras or sensors that just perceive or make snapshots of what is already there. And there's, for example, a Libet experiment to find out free will, and they measured the delay between action and consciousness of that action, and they find pretty much always the same thing, namely that action comes first and consciousness of an action comes after, which is also very interesting. But it is not compatible with the Western scientific worldview, which is also very important. But that does not mean that there is no responsibility or choice, by the way. It just means that there is no chooser. There's still choice happening, but the chooser is not there, which kind of makes it non-choice. But people usually have a very hard time dealing with that, and I have to answer a lot of questions concerning that when people ask me about meditation and insights. Practically, there is choice until the burden of choice has been laid down. Again, I say that over and over again, but you must liberate yourself through your sense of choice. If you deny it, then you cannot fix it. Again, very important. And just one more experiment to really let the message sink in. This is an exercise about predicting thoughts that can be very liberating. In fact, that was one of the main ways I liked to contemplate non-self in the beginning. And again, first part, second part, you know the drill. Try to sit down in meditation and restrain your senses. Endure all the cravings and the pressure of arising bad emotions or feelings until they vanish in your mind and everything becomes clear and bright without much desire. Then you could stop the formal meditation or just try to continue meditation and try to predict what part of your body will move next, as an example. It can be the eyes, some kind of scratching, some head movement, breathing, or any other movement. Just try to accurately and honestly predict a bodily movement or a mental movement, namely a thought. And guess what will happen next, or what will be the thought after this, the next thought, or the thought after that. And try to think about it and try it out and ponder it a little bit and pause the video to really let the message sink in and not give me, have the solutions handed to you by me. But yeah, chances are very good that you can't predict any of those, and thus you cannot be the master and controller of those things. Yet it feels like you are the master and controller of those things. And the more self-honest you are, the fewer things will appear to be under your control. This is why enlightenment is sometimes compared to realizing that life is a dream, or that you have dreamed up your life, dreamed up your sense of control. It is not really there, which is very important. You cannot predict even a single thought. It always happens before you become conscious of it. You can guess right, but this is usually only your brain tricking yourself into believing that you did indeed do the thought instead of discover the thought, to put it like that. And now we come to the most important section of probably the entire lecture series, namely the Heartwood of the Dhamma, the teachings that are special to the Buddha, the teachings on right view or dependent origination. And this one, as a person who strives for awakening, who strives for liberation, should spend a lot of time trying to understand this. Because without the understanding, the experiential understanding of this, there can be no liberation of mind. There can be weakening of craving, but there can never be uprooting of craving. And this is a trap that many advanced practitioners fall into. They weaken their craving so much that they think they are liberated, but in essence, they are oftentimes still missing this core insight. And thus, they will likely have to start all over again in the future, when their craving resurfaces in the future and they realize they made a grave mistake. But yeah, again, I want to start with a small experiment or a small exercise that you can do to explain how a simple act of knowledge or a simple insight or a simple understanding can remove suffering from your experience, because many people struggle with that. They have no idea how it possibly could be that knowledge could set you free. Yeah, imagine that you were having some trouble breathing and you decide to do a checkup at your doctor. As he is not quite sure what is wrong with you, he does a series of tests and then you are admitted to the hospital. Most people would be very nervous by now. If the doctor then gives you the diagnosis of lung cancer, how would you feel? It is just a knowledge that changed. How would you feel? Think about it for a moment. Would you suffer? Yeah. most people would suffer tremendously. And if the doctor later realizes that he made a mistake and explains that you just had a cold and the test went wrong, you would experience extreme relief and joy. The simple, in this case, false knowledge of cancer will turn your entire life upside down. And the knowledge that it was a mistake will correct that again, immediately. And it is the same with Buddhist insight, but much more intense by magnitudes. As it is not a false knowledge, it is a true knowledge, and it has a capacity to uproot the entire mass of suffering that you are facing. And now a word on the precedence of assumptions, and I want to remind yourself of something very important, namely that reasoning and logic, as we discussed in chapter 0, works based on axioms or facts that we know. This knowing, however, is most of the time implicit or unknown to us, like the sense of self. We cannot see the self. We can only notice it when it is gone. Your implicit assumptions are further ordered by significance, and some of those assumptions are more significant than others. Facts about politics that we just assume are probably not as significant than our self-view. Our self-view, as an example, is more or less the most significant of our implicit assumptions. So we really need something that is even more significant than that to even to uproot that wrong assumption. Yeah. And as you don't know those things explicitly, this is also very, very important and one of the key aspects of the entire teaching, you cannot change them directly. You need an indirect approach to uproot your sense of self. You have to understand the dependence framework, what those things, those implicit views depend upon, and then remove the conditions for that thing to arise so that you can remove it. Because you cannot see it. You cannot remove something directly that you cannot see. And that is why the Buddha is such a genius, by the way. He uprooted unknown assumptions without any help or knowing the tools out of basically an infinite many possible options. And then he could also teach that. And this is a true strike of genius. And the first person who does that is flat out a genius. That person teaching others, that makes it less, it's still very impressive if someone becomes an arahant, or even some person of right view, namely a sotapanna. But it's much, much more amazing by magnitudes if a person just comes up with that on their own and is able to teach it. But yeah, what the Buddha did is like a brute force bootstrapping approach in computer science. He does all the groundwork, all the difficult things, and all the other people can then benefit from that by simply saying, oh yeah, this is pretty much like what the Buddha did, or pretty much what Einstein did, or what any other person who proved something in mathematics did. And it is also important to notice that we have to undo our wrong assumptions, our wrong implicit assumptions, more or less layer by layer. We have a lot of wrong assumptions, but it's a finite amount. It does not continue forever. So when you keep at it, you will be liberated at some point. Okay, and now to the fact that we are already affected by wrong view, just to let that message really sink in. Unenlightened experience, when you are not awakened, is 100% certain that it is right. Your view and your experience constantly reaffirm your view of control. Whatever you do, you are doing it. Your mind convinces you of that fact. And you are always implicitly and unknowingly affected by that wrong assumption. And that wrong assumption or view or belief, or however you want to call it, occurs very early in that chain of facts or axioms that we just assume and base our entire experience on. We always think that we know what words etc. mean, but oftentimes it is wrong ideas, as we have discussed in chapter 4. We always mean something, but what we really mean is often unknown to us. And those examples for implicit assumptions are control, externalness, ownership. Everything in our experience constantly reaffirms that those things are there, that we have control, that we are inside our head, behind our eyes, and watching the entire external world from there. Yet, in reality, it is not like that. And this error can only be seen afterwards. And awakening is about stopping to assume those wrong things. That's why everyone can do it, simply because it is the stopping of doing something. And this is possible for basically everyone. You don't need the genius or mastermind of the Buddha. You can just do it as an average person. It's just a matter of keeping at it, going through the motions, doing the drills, doing the gradual training. That is how things that we, as we believe them to be, can cease completely. So what ceases is not the feelings or something as an example. It is just what we thought feelings were cease to exist. The 5 aggregates, as the Buddha often said, are still there for an arahant, but they are no longer what they were before. So our understanding of things change, which is very important. And I like to illustrate the entire point even further with this kind of diagram. The outmost rectangle describes our true reality and the freedom from suffering, which comes through understanding the true reality of things. But our thinking is caged pretty much. We are limiting ourselves to just a tiny proportion of this kind of true reality. And this common logical thinking is more or less based on axioms or facts or hypotheses or assumptions that we assume to know, that we just take for granted without ever questioning them. And some of them are so significant that we cannot uproot them with logic. It's impossible to arrive at the Dhamma by means of reason alone, as we discussed in the last chapter. And this is why we need the 3 marks or the 3 perceptions, because they are such a significant part of our experience that they even precede those kind of implicit assumptions. And thus, the perception of anicca can change and uproot our self-view, because it is even more significant than logic. Anicca concerns itself with things that must be there for logic and views to even work, with the there-ness of things, the aspect of there-ness. And now I want to give you a very important citation and a very good citation in 2 parts from Nanaviratera, a person who very much contributed to the resurfacing of the good Dhamma in the West. And he said in one of his books, a man with avijja, which is ignorance or forgetfulness of the 3 marks, practicing reflection, may identify self with both his reflexive or his immediate experience. And reflexive experience is pretty much mindfulness. So he either thinks that he is the material part or the reflexive part, the mindfulness part of the experience, or with the reflexive part alone, only the mindfulness, or with the immediate part alone, or with both. He can have self in both things. But he does not conclude that neither of those parts is self. And the reason for that is quite clear. It is not possible to get outside of avijja by the means of reflection alone, by only mindfulness, by only logic. You can step back how far you want. You are always taking your wrong views with you. There is just as much ignorance in the self-observer as in the observed part of experience, because there's no real difference between the two. And this is the very reason why avijja, namely wrong understanding, misunderstanding Dhamma, is so stable, despite the fact that it can be changed. Your wrong understanding, your wrong views are obviously something that can be changed. And one could imagine that we should already be free and not trapped in samsara if wrong views are something so unstable. But this kind of wrong view is, for a sankhara, for something that changes, extremely stable and is always reaffirming. Simply by reflection or by thinking, pondering, reasoning, a puthujjana, which is an unenlightened person, can never observe avijja at the same time recognizing it as avijja. For in reflection, in mindfulness, avijja is both the judge and the accused. So the verdict is always not guilty. So in order to put an end to avijja, to wrong knowledge, which is a matter of recognizing wrong knowledge as wrong knowledge, so it ceases to be wrong knowledge, it is necessary to accept on trust or on faith the teachings from the Buddha or someone who learned it from the Buddha that contradicts every bit of your experience and every bit of your reflection capability. And you have to do something so foreign to you, so long, that it sets you free. This is why Dhamma is going against the stream, pretty much going against the grain, because you have to do something that goes against your entire experience, that confirms itself over and over again. And that is something that is very hard to do. This is why Dhamma will always be a niche interest. No matter how hard I try on this channel as an example, I don't think that there will ever be a very big audience, simply because I try to limit myself to really the good Dhamma and not to some kind of, false promises that many other spiritual teachers make. Yeah. And here is another citation from the sutta. You can scan the QR code if you wish. It's from Majjhima Nikaya 72. And again, it concerns itself with wrong assumptions. And the Buddha was talking in the sutta with a person called Vajja. And he was asking lots of speculative questions to the Buddha. And then the conversation goes as follows. When Master Gotama is asked these 4 questions, he replies, the term reappears does not apply. And then the Buddha said, suppose a fire were burning before you. Would you know this fire is burning before me? Vajja obviously agrees. And with the fire before you was extinguished, to which direction did it go? To the east, to the west, to the north, or to the south? Being asked thus, what would you answer? And Vajja answers, that does not apply, Master Gotama. The fire burned independent of fuel, of grass or sticks, and when that is used up, it does not get any more fuel. Without fuel, it is reckoned as extinguished. So the Buddha is describing freedom from samsara here. The person was inquiring the Buddha about the destinations of people after death. Where does an arahant go? Does he go this way or that way? And the Buddha just said, no, he does not go anywhere. The term rebirth simply does not apply to an arahant anymore. Just like a fire does not go to the north, to the east, to the south, or to the west when it is extinguished, an arahant has no rebirth destination. So yeah, but you can read those suttas up yourself if you wish. And again, the goal is an understanding. I always want to emphasize this over and over again. It is not about an experience that you have in meditation. It is about understanding any experience in their nature. And then you can be set free, liberated from your own mind on account of that, as you realize that your own mind is not your own. And the goal is, as mentioned before, to perfectly align your understanding of reality. And this applies to all the concepts and words that the Buddha used. If you perfectly align feeling, the Buddha talked about, with your idea of feelings, then you would probably be an arahant. But as there is still some misunderstanding, some wrong view, we cannot really do that. So we must really try over and over again and never think that we are done too soon. And then we have a chance. And for those of you who are interested, there is also an interesting sutta in Samyutta Nikaya 36.6, where the Buddha discusses how the arahant feels and how the unenlightened person feels, and what the difference would be. Namely, the arahant feels feelings detached, while the Pethujana, the unenlightened person, feels a feeling like he was a feeling. Directly inside, he owns that feeling, and thus he suffers from it. And now to the indirect uprooting part of the self-assumption. And again, this is a small exercise, and I like to really make this one very clear, because people always try to look for the self, or hunt down the self, or search for the self. This can never work. The self is invisible. It is implicit. You can only notice it once it is gone. It must be done indirectly. So again, here's a small exercise. Imagine that you are 100% convinced of the flat earth conspiracy theory. You put that idea, in terms of significance, above all others. And whenever someone challenges that idea of yours, you can easily explain it away by, being part of the round earth conspiracy or something. Could you let go of such an attachment of yours easily? You can take something else where you are really attached, like to a political view, where you are convinced that your party is so much more right than the other party. Could you let go of that view? And the answer is very likely that you can't. Logic is based on often unknown assumptions, or pretty much always unknown assumptions, at least for a Pethujana. Some are first in importance or significance, and opinions follow from them. We have to find something that includes, as an example, the flat earth theory, but has no attachment if I want to convince you otherwise. So I must convince you indirectly by convincing you of something that is even more significant, but without the attachment. If I can convince you, as an example, that planets overall are round, like that the Venus is round, the Jupiter is round, Saturn is round, and all the other planets are round, it will quickly follow that the Earth is possibly round too. And it is the same with the self. You have sankharas, which are determinations, the causes for your self-view, as an example, which are more significant than your view of self. So when I can convince you that the causes for yourself are impermanent, then it will follow that yourself must be impermanent too. But you have no real attachment to the sankharas, so you are open to be convinced on that, layer, but you are not open to be convinced on the other layer, because yourself reaffirms itself all the time. And thus you cannot break free simply by watching yourself. You must proceed indirectly, otherwise it is not possible. And again, the shift can be explained by this small exercise. Imagine being a tadpole, which is born in the water, having never seen or experienced air or land. Your entire experience is without air or land. Try to imagine what it is like, and then compare it with the experience of self. Again, the self is ever present, just like water for a tadpole. And the solution is, you implicitly assume, as a tadpole, that water is all there is. Once you grow up, however, once you train your mind, tame your mind, you can break through the water surface, and then the knowledge arises. Also, this is what water was like. Before that, you cannot know what water was like, because you had no point of reference. When water is all there is, you cannot distinguish it or pinpoint it. And you did not even know that the water was pressuring you either. So some things can only be known and seen after they have ceased, after you have another state that you can compare the initial state with. And this is especially true for the sense of self, which is again very important to keep in mind. And now we come to the absolute core of the Dhamma, namely the teachings of dependent origination, which are depicted in the Wheel of Arising, which I have taken from the Dependent Origination and Emptiness book from Lee Brasington. I like to remind you of the following. You have to devalue sensuality before. You need a reason to actually investigate dependent origination. Without such a reason, you will not do it. There's no reason for you to do it, because it challenges your experience. So you need usually suffering greater than that to even consider contemplating the Dhamma, which is why the divine messengers or death contemplations or essential urgency like Samvega is necessary. So it is a precondition to seeing Anicca, and Anicca means seeing the true Dhamma. And seeing Anicca rightly for the first time breaks the prison that you have created for your own mind. And it's the first goal and the first major milestone in the meditative practice. And now we will have a look at the chain of dependent origination. I have taken it from Digha Nikaya, number 14, but it is repeated everywhere in the entire suttas, as it is literally one of the core concepts, or if not the core concept of the entire Buddhist teachings. And usually this chain is presented in another order, and I find it very hard to understand for new practitioners in that other order. Usually it says that, the suffering follows from the self, as an example. But this is not how it should be regarded. It should be regarded as a chain of dependence. So we like to look at it in the other order, namely that suffering, aging, death, and decay, or jara marana, depend on the self. Suffering, aging, death, and decay cannot exist without the self, which is jati. This is very important. And the next factor, namely the self, cannot exist without you giving the self its being, without you putting it there in the world as an option. And that again, that being cannot be there without our implicit self-assumption, without our clinging, without upadana, which exists in regard to the five aggregates, but is not really part of the five aggregates. And that clinging cannot be there without craving. So without craving, it is impossible for clinging to exist. Only because tanha is there can upadana exist. And you always crave in regard to feeling. So craving cannot exist without you taking up the ownership of your feelings. Again, I always put some self and me and mine and I in brackets oftentimes in many of those terms. They are there in all of them. And this is what you remove from this chain of dependent origination. You do not remove the feeling. You remove the ownership of the feeling. And this is probably the most misunderstood part when it comes to dependent origination. People really think that you remove the consciousness. This is why the view that there is a blinking out of consciousness is what stream entry is surfaced, in my opinion at least. I'm only speculating here because I don't have that view. But people really think that consciousness has to stop. Yes, consciousness stops in the way that you have previously thought of consciousness. What you thought of as consciousness stops, as an example. What you thought of as feeling stops by removing the self. It changes everything while still the aggregates remain pretty much there. And feeling, as an example, can only remain there standing based on contact or pressure. And again, this is also something that people greatly misunderstand. They think that the entire thing is based on contact of something external with a feeling. But that is not true. What is contacted is yourself, your sense of self. It is not that something external comes into contact with a sensory organ and then it becomes something else. No, what gets contacted is your sense of self. And when that gets contacted, all the other things arise. When you remove that contact with your sense of self, then the other things cannot arise anymore. And that contact, on the other hand, depends on you taking up the ownership of the body. Your sixth sense base, again, this is very important, it's a singular, it's not sixth sense basis, as it's often translated. It's one sixth sense base, it is a body. You cannot have contact without having a body. Could you imagine having a feeling without having a body? Without owning the body, without taking up the ownership of the body, the other things that are even further down the line cannot arise. When you remove the self at the level of the 5, where we are right now, all the other things cannot be there, as they fully depend on it. So whenever you remove something, then at a lower level, all the other levels will vanish too. And the body is based on the distinction between nama and rupa. So the physical part and the designation part, pretty much, which in turn depend on consciousness, vijnana. So without you taking up consciousness, which is probably one of the most subtlest elements in this entire chain, without you doing that, you cannot have the other self-views that result from this one self-view. And then we have determinations or sankhara, which determine consciousness. So even consciousness has an activity aspect to it, has an intentional aspect to it. It has self in it, and that self of consciousness depends on I-making, mine-making, me-making, which is an activity that can be stopped by removing, ultimately, the non-knowing of Dhamma or the ignorance of the 3 marks, which is avijja. So this is how this entire chain pretty much plays out. We try to influence this chain now at basically 2 points. We try to remove the misunderstanding, the ignorance of the 3 marks from all those things in this chain. And as soon as you break this chain at pretty much 1 point, you attain the right view. And your entire perception will invert itself and you will suddenly see everything in a different light, which is the experience of a stream enterer pretty much. We will later see that this is not completely true, but yeah, it's still useful to make that distinction. So what we try to remove is the ignorance that all those things that are named in this chain are ultimately unownable. Consciousness is not unownable. Everything that feels like doing, determinations, fabrications, however you want to call them, all those things are unownable. They happen on their own. They are not yours as a result of that. They do not happen for you. They are not yours. You are not the owner. None of those things apply. And by seeing that repeatedly, and it really has to be drilled in, seeing it once is not enough, seeing it twice is not enough. You have to see it 1,000 times, if not more, as Buddhist nun Ayakema often said. It really is a training, a gradual training that has to be repeated over and over again. Only then can you really undo the habit of ignorance. Because it really is a habit that has to be reaffirmed constantly. Once you stop being ignorant, it can only be there for so long before it fully vanishes and you are completely liberated and become an arahant. But yeah, let us now continue. Again, this is a proof by contradiction in essence, as we have learned in chapter 2. And I can make it an exercise for you so that you can contemplate it maybe a bit better. So first, you can ask yourself a few questions. Some of those will appeal more to you than others. If you are in control, why don't you have exclusively good feelings? Why? If you are in control, why can't you predict your next thought, word, or deed? If you are in control, why don't you perceive exclusively beautiful things? The Buddha asked those kinds of questions very often to wandering ascetics. And if their minds were well trained, they grasped the significance of those questions and their behavior changed. If your mind is not yet trained enough in virtue, then those questions will probably mean nothing to you. If your self is permanent, then why can't you make thoughts, words, or deeds stay eternally? Yet those influences are always impossible. Maybe ponder about those questions a bit and try to answer them honestly. Self-honesty, again, is an absolutely necessary precondition. And in essence, the mind is a truth-seeking machine. Understanding reality correctly leads to us always predicting better, and thus we have a better chance at surviving. So the mind rapidly changes its assumptions when presented with conflicting evidence. And the Buddha never said that we should just believe him. He suggested that we take what we falsely believe at face value and lead it to a contradiction with observable reality. He pretty much said, yeah, accept that view of yours for now, but then based on that, try to find contradictions. And then the mind will correct that contradiction and your view will be correcter than before. We feel 100% convinced that our views are right, pretty much always, as we have to indirectly overcome our possible wrong assumptions. I really want to repeat that over and over again because it is so important. Again, for example, as an easy example that might be easy to understand, if you want to convince someone that gravity is wrong, you just have to convince him how to float or show him how to float. And suppose we have a self that is permanent in control, take anything where you feel like you have control, what would follow from it? And most of the time, it immediately leads to a contradiction. Or always, because there is nothing that you could call self in the five aggregates. But yeah, let us continue. Again, there are some prerequisites for this kind of understanding. Namely, that a reactive mind, a mind that is not virtuous, cannot see properly. It cannot be properly mindful. And reactiveness just means non-virtue. It is like looking through muddy water. You cannot see like that. And reacting leads to losing sight of the background of experience and forgetting yourself, so to speak. And insights are always to be found in the background of experience, as the background is more significant than the foreground. The background of experience arises first, and then you can single out certain things and assign significance to them. And if you always cover up your craving, as an example, you can never calmly examine it and never understand its source, because you make it immediately go away. How can you understand something that is not there? You must understand it in your experience, recognized experience, as I often say, and that requires those things to be there. So yeah, you must learn to let things endure in the mind, especially the bad feeling things. It's like taming an animal, but the mind is really hard to tame in comparison. You must further be able to see or know two things at once. Be occupied with one thing and notice how the other things that you usually attribute your sense of self to still happen. And to attain insight into craving, you must allow it to endure in the mind. Otherwise, you can never inspect it. It would be a contradiction. If you still act out of your craving and immediately make it go away, then you cannot inspect it, never notice that it is painful, and all the other things cannot follow. So I also like to illustrate the entire background thing with this figure. In the middle, we have our focus object, what we are currently attending to, and then there are all kinds of background emotions, thoughts, feelings, smells, touches, and whatever going on. All those things happen at the same time. And then there's Vedana going on in the background. Everything has a slight connotation of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral attached to them. Then there are perceptions and consciousness, which is very subtle. And very peripherally are the three marks, namely Anicca, Dukkha, and Anatta. And for us to notice that, we have to be able to discern things in the background of our experience. You can never see Anatta while looking very closely at your sensations. You must be able to look into the background of experience, into the entirety of your experience, and then with a stable enough mind, with a non-reactive enough mind, you can discern those three marks. But again, it is not an easy thing. And to undermine your sense of self, you must try to not get rid of things, you must inspect them. You must put dependent origination into practice. Your unknown assumptions require an indirect approach. I cannot repeat that often enough. Instead of counteracting suffering, you remove what it relies upon. And suffering relies, for example, on craving, which relies on a feeling, on your ownership of that feeling. And seeing that feeling is already there, namely impermanent. It is happening and changing on its own. Helps uproot the ownership and the attachment to that feeling. And when you remove it on the level of feelings, then what can remain? Then the craving will go away, and freedom from craving is what enlightenment is, and then all the other things vanish too. Everything that relies on feeling will vanish as a result, and suffering, also as a result, can no longer arise. And focus on most significant aspects of your experience, like the ownership, control, or externalness in things like your mind, your feeling, or even your intentions. That's where it truly matters, but it requires a well-restrained and a well-trained mind to see the three marks in things that are so general, that are so subtle. And again, here is another way of looking at it to show you the dependence hierarchy of significance. All the small wantings of specific images, smells, sounds, thoughts, touches, or tastes fully rely on craving to be there. Those things cannot exist without craving. And craving, the entirety of all possible cravings, cannot exist without you taking up the ownership of your feeling, of your Vedana. Without that, it is not possible to crave such things or to take up the ownership of those things. Those are completely embedded, and this is extremely important to understand. And the entire concept of determinations of Sankhara Dhamma, this relationship, can be understood with this exercise that I have taken from the suttas. Again, first and second part are clear by now. Nandaka, one of the Buddha's disciples, compared dependent origination with a growing tree. Imagine the tree, as the roots of the tree, are they impermanent? Are the branches impermanent? Are the leaves impermanent? And how about the shadow of the tree, which has an entirely different nature? Are those things impermanent? Maybe think about it for a while, and then we continue. Okay, it would be foolish to say that the shadow of the tree is not impermanent if any of the other things, any of the other aspects of a tree is impermanent. The shadow as a whole is completely and fully determined in a non-temporal way by outside things, by things that are outside of its domain, yet it is fully dependent on those things. And in the same way, our current discomfort, our current suffering, depends like leaves on a branch, which depends like cravings on a feeling. And that feeling, however, that has arisen on its own. So how could we ever control or own it? You can directly experience that your sense of self is determined like the shadow of a tree. So when you notice, oh, all the things in the world happen first, and then the sense of self comes, then the sense of self becomes non-self. And I really like to illustrate that in detail because people really have a hard time accepting that. So essentially what we see here is a chain of dependence. The suffering here at the right depends on a self, which depends on lust, which depends on good feelings as an example, which depends on the body. Good feelings cannot exist without you having a body. Can you even think about having good feelings without a body? No, they are felt in the body. And you can only have lust or want more good feelings if there already are good feelings. And the self can be regarded as a mechanism of the mind that tries to get us what we lust for. So the self can only exist when there is lust. And suffering, or the pressure to fix what we want, to get what we want, can only be there when there is a self trying to fix things. And the same is, by the way, true for hatred. Hatred can only exist in relation to a bad feeling, or aversion. Let's call it aversion, that might be easier to understand. So whenever there is aversion, it must be in relation to a bad feeling. We always feel averse to a bad feeling, which in turn could not be there without us taking up the ownership of the body. And the self, again, can only arise based on that aversion, because the self tries to fix that aversion and make it go away. Without that aversion, the self would have nothing to do, and then it could just poof, go away. And the same is, by the way, also true for any neutral feeling. The neutral, the impulse to distract ourselves, which is also called ignorance, or could you translate as ignorance, can only be there when there is a neutral feeling that you must distract yourself from. But again, the feeling is beyond your control. It changes however it wishes, without you having any say in the process. And the feeling depends on the body. And the body is also something that you cannot own. So all those things happen automatically. And at some point in the chain, you say, yeah, from this point onward, it is me. My self completely relies on things outside of the control, outside of our control. All those things are just changing according to cause and effect. And at some point we say, yep, now it is on us. This is foolish. And we must see this directly in our experience over and over again. And then the assumption, the implicit assumption of ownership, gets uprooted indirectly. As you can see, we do not look at the self directly here, or at the suffering, or anything like that. We look at elements that are further down the chain. We look at the feeling and recognize this one as impermanent, or at the body as the sixth sense base, and recognize that as impermanent. And as a result, all the other things will also be impermanent when the mind understands the interconnection between all those factors and understands the feelings or the body or whatever as impermanent. This is how you uproot the sense of self, indirectly and not directly. And practically, Anicca or Anatta can be seen as follows. First experience, again, is very profound and it will change everything. But it can only be seen, the Anatta can only be seen, based on seeing Anicca correctly. And it's like being born blind and then seeing for the first time. And it can be induced by disenchantment, dispassion through contemplating repulsiveness, contradictions, death contemplations, divine messenger events. All those things can be conditions that are necessary. And you can really take anything where you feel or assume control and then lead it to a contradiction, indirectly, proof by contradiction. Notice the dependence on things outside of the control. The most fundamental phrasing of dependent origination is, with this is. With feeling, there is craving. Without feeling, there is no craving. And it doesn't really matter what pair you take. It's a principle of dependent origination. What you insert into the this and this, or you could phrase it that if that makes it easier, that does not matter. Without feeling, there cannot be craving. Without feeling, there cannot be self. Without feeling, there cannot be suffering. Without taking up the ownership of feeling, I should say, there cannot be suffering, etc. So what you insert there does not really matter. It just matters that you take one thing that appears to be in your control and notice the dependence or the dependence on one thing that is outside of your control. That is all. That is the right view. Once you attain that and see it in your experience, and it really is binary, either you see it in your experience or you don't, then you are suddenly free and become a noble one. And one of the pairs, or very useful pairs, can be seen as follows. Yourself relies on your body. Yourself relies on your senses. Yourself relies on your feelings. And the sutta that I stated there, it's probably from the Sutta Nipata, contains pretty much all possible pairs. And our Buddha Gautama was the foremost when it comes to expounding the Dhamma. Buddhas that came before him mainly relied on just two aspects. That was enough for people to attain liberation. For example, on the relationship between Namarupa and consciousness or something like that. One thing outside of your control, the other thing also outside of your control. And thus everything is determined by each other and nothing can be yours. Many ways to end up at the same thing. And this impermanence that we must see, we must always see non-self through impermanence, has different aspects. Impermanence can be seen differently, but it's always uncomfortable because it always undermines our sense of control. And whenever our sense of control is challenged, we feel challenged. It can feel very bad, but this is what we must go through. And ultimately, it is a huge release, a huge relief when we see this rightly. And impermanence has an aspect of increasing, ceasing, and enduring while changing. But all of those things have in common that certain things must be there to increase in their presence, or to cease, to become less of itself, or to change. It always presupposes that things are already there. Then, on the basis of those things already being there, they can do all kinds of things on their own. That is the important aspect. Things that you assume you are doing, in reality, change on their own. This is the knowledge of impermanence. And some monks are skilled in discerning any of those. You don't have to do all of them. It is completely enough to focus on one of those aspects. And all of them undermine our sense of control and our sense of ownership. And the first or last point of anything can never really be discerned. People always interpret this statement in a very false way. They always act like first one thing comes into being, then a thing stays there for a while, and then the thing ceases to exist. But the Buddha never gave that in that order. It is always increasing, ceasing, and then changing, and not increasing, changing, and then ceasing. And this is probably one of the biggest misunderstandings that exist nowadays. And having a first point would require stepping outside of your experience and would presuppose a self, which in turn would just be another wrong view that leads to more of samsara and more sense of control. And many modern practitioners fall for it. You cannot actively stop your control. It always comes through dispassion. And through the dispassion comes through noticing, oh, I can't change what I thought I can change. And as a result, we become liberated. And the entire thing can also be explained with this kind of figure. We could, for example, contemplate the body through our senses. So our eye perceives our own body. And then it notices, oh, the body changes first. The body has moved, and then I notice that the body has moved. So the assumption of control must fade, because the body must always move first. The eye can only discover the change of the body, but it can never do the body. It can never change the body, as an example. So there's always a slight delay that you can discover. And as a result, your sense of self becomes non-self. And now we would come to a contemplation overall, or when it comes to more practical approaches to the entire thing. And I hope I have already made it clear in many ways. But this one is more for the next lecture. But yeah, I think this is really enough for today. We have talked for over an hour, and I really hope that you now have a better understanding on how to approach the entire thing, how you can really gain the right view, the right perspective on things, on how to get completely free from suffering. So yeah, again, if you enjoy what I do, and if you think that you profit from this lecture or know anyone else who could profit from this lecture, feel free to link it to them so they can profit too. And thus it might gain a bit more popularity, because it's hard to bring the true Dhamma to people, because it can be uncomfortable at times, and people always go for the approaches that seem more comfortable, even though when they are wrong. It's just the nature of humans. Anyway, thank you again for watching until the end. And maybe see you again in the next lecture next week. Have a nice day and goodbye.